Coming up, the Brooklyn Nets season came to a merciful close, and Sean Marks addressed the media about the state of the rebuild. I'll touch on all that and more after this. What is up, Nets world? We're back here on the Believe in Nets podcast and the Believe Podcast Network. I'm your host, Erik Slater, Brooklyn Nets beat reporter for ClutchPoints.com. And before we get into anything, if you do not already subscribe to this show, go to my YouTube channel at Erik Slater NBA. Subscribe. If you enjoy this content and you're watching on YouTube right now, hit the like button, leave a comment. Only takes a second. Really helps for engagement and everything along those lines. But on today's episode, I just had Brian Lewis of the New York Post, recurring guest and friend of the pod, on to talk about the state of the Nets, really, and a season wrap-up. The Nets season came to a close on Sunday. They lost to the New York Knicks, their 10th straight loss to the Knicks. And Sean Marks and the rest of the players addressed the media on Monday and spoke on a bunch of different subjects spanning the team's overall rebuild strategy, into specific players, into free agents, and into all of that. But just some housekeeping before we get to the interview with Brian. Obviously, the Nets season came to a close. They clinched and locked in the sixth best odds in May's draft lottery. The draft lottery will be on May 12th in Chicago. I'm going to be going out there for that. And that is going to be one of the most important days in Nets history, and definitely the most important day in recent Nets memory, to see where they land in this draft. They're going to have, I've outlined this, but they have a 9% chance of the number one pick. They have a 37% chance of being in the top four. And they will have, I think it's about a 60% chance of being in pick 6 through 8. So we'll see where they come out of that. But those are the odds that the Nets have ended with based on how they handled this season and this rebuild. There was also some draft implications, draft positioning implications in this game with the Knicks, because the Nets obviously have the Knicks' first-round pick as part of the Mikal Bridges trade. And going into that game on Sunday, they were in 26, the draft pick was, but there was picks 22 through 25 were one game ahead or one game behind, however you want to look at it, of the Knicks in the draft order. So had the Nets gone hard and tried to win that game, or if they were able to win that game, they would have fallen the Knicks into a tie for picks 20 through 26, which is decided by a coin flip. So had the Nets won that game, the Knicks pick could have fallen anywhere from 22 to 26, depending on coin flips. But the Nets were playing a skeleton crew, basically. You know, D'Angelo Russell, Cam Johnson, Day'Ron Sharpe, Zaire Williams were all out. The only active starter was Nick Claxton, and he did not play the fourth quarter, so they didn't show much urgency to try to win that game, at least in terms of their lineups. And they end up falling to the New York Knicks, who were playing also exclusively backups. And that locks that pick in at 26th, as opposed to it having a chance to be as high as 22. So based on that, the Nets, I said, sixth best lottery odds. The Milwaukee Bucks pick is in a three-way tie for picks 18, 19, 20. So that'll be decided by a coin flip. Can be anywhere from 18 to 20. The Knicks pick 26, and they also have the Rockets pick, which is 27th. And their second-round pick that they got back in the Knicks trade, which is their own, is 36. So the Nets will have 5 picks within the top 36, sixth best odds, and then 18 to 20, 26, 27, 36. We'll see where they land in all that. We'll see how they maneuver in the draft. But I think there's a lot of rebuild questions in terms of, are the Nets going to commit to a tank next season? Are they potentially going to look to cash in some assets and go after a star? How are the free agents going to shake out? The Nets, the Cam Thomas, Day'Ron Sharpe, these other guys that are going to hit restricted free agency for the Nets. We talked about all that and more with Sean Marks, as well as a lot of the Nets players. I thought it was really informative, and Sean was pretty forthcoming with a lot of his responses, particularly to a couple of questions that I asked him about their rebuild strategy. So I talked about all that with Brian. Hope you guys really enjoy that talk after a quick break. And I'm joined now by Brian Lewis of the New York Post, friend of the pod and colleague of mine on the Nets beat. And Brian, Nets season has come to a close. We got to speak to Sean Marks and all of the Nets players on Monday. And the number one question, obviously, about the Nets entering this summer is, are they going to commit to a tank for next season, or are they going to trade for a star and expedite their timeline? We both got to ask Sean Marks questions about that subject. What was your top takeaway from his responses and what he had to say?
My top takeaway was that they seem perfectly comfortable uh, going into next season, for lack of a better term, in this tank, this rebuild, whatever you want to call it. Um, and it would take a lot to get them to move off of that. It would get a player that essentially, in Sean Marks's words, would transform the team and make them a contender. Short of that, they're comfortable looking and trying to rebuild based off of another lottery pick. And in my mind, there aren't that many players that fit that bill. In Sean Marks's mind, I don't know how many there are. And of the ones that there are, surely most of them will not be available. So he pretty much narrowed it down for you.
Yep, and I asked him, what would you be looking for in a star level acquisition? Because I know plenty of Nets fans. A lot of fans have asked me, would they be comfortable committing to a tank? A lot of people are skeptical after, they did tank this season, but it wasn't as, blatant as some people might have wanted. And people have been asking me, are they going to be comfortable doing this? I don't think they'll want to do this. I think they're going to go for the quick fix for the star. And the exact quote Sean said, if you're going after max level talent, they have to automatically and absolutely change the trajectory of your team. This can't be like, let's go get this guy and lock ourselves into being a 6-7 seed. When we go all in, we're going in to compete at the highest level and contend. And obviously, a guy who's going to absolutely transform in the trajectory of your team, like that's open to interpretation. And, that's not as cut and dry maybe as some people would think reading it. But the way I interpreted it is you're talking about like those 1A level superstar players, those guys who can be the top level player on a championship team. Obviously, Giannis Antetokounmpo is a guy that you have reported about, but outside of him, as you just noted, there's not really a guy like that who's clear cut, who could be available on the star market. People have talked about guys like Zion Williamson, John Morant, Domantas Sabonis, LaMelo Ball. We'll see like what happens with those guys. But the way I interpreted those comments was those players that I just named outside of Giannis, that the Nets wouldn't be eager to trade a bunch of assets and bring that type of salary onto their books. Is that kind of the read that you got on it?
That's absolutely the read I got on it. Now, listen, I understand that LaMelo Ball, I think, was like second among all guard vote getters. I get it that he's incredibly popular and he's spectacular and he's fun to watch. Um, I think watching Charlotte play is evidence that that is not a guy who single handedly makes you a contender. And all of those players are wonderful players. In my mind, none of those fit that description. Um, I would contend that I don't see any of them ever fitting that description, with the possible exception of Zion if everything went right, which is always possible. He's still a young guy. So maybe if somebody took a swing on that and just hoped that you reach that outcome, Giannis has already reached that outcome. Mm-hmm. You know what he is. So to me, this sounds like Giannis or bust.
And the reason
what you did this year, or perhaps pair off even more guys from the roster, which I know would make a lot of the fans happy.
And we'll get more into the Giannis thing, but there could be an argument, like some fans have said to me, well, if you can get a Sabonis or if you can get a Zion or a LaMelo for, like the discounted rate, and you don't have to give up as much as you got for Giannis. And maybe that could be like the first guy into, looking to be the next guy. But the read I've got it, and the thing I've tried to say to those people is that there's an opportunity cost a lot, that goes along with doing something like that. And the opportunity cost is you're taking yourself presumably out of the tank race for this next draft, and these guys like Darren Peterson, AJ DeBonsta, Cam Boozer. And I think that's what Sean was saying when we're not going to lock ourselves into being a 6 or 7 seed. The way that I think they should be operating, and it seems like it's the way that Sean is going about this, is if we're not getting that Giannis, that 1A type guy that would warrant us passing up on this opportunity at these top guys in this next draft, we're not going to do it. So it would really take that opportunity to really take that massive leap to get the Nets to pass up on the opportunity really to tank next season and to have a shot at one of those guys who people think this draft is extremely highly regarded. People think the top of that draft is even more highly regarded and are even more excited about those prospects. So that gives you a sense of, the gravity of the situation and what the Nets would be passing up in that, situation. If they were to go for a quick fix that wouldn't put them in that, upper echelon of teams, it really wouldn't make sense. Now, as you said, Giannis is the guy, it seems like, if they are going to go that star route. You've reported several times this year that the Nets would be in the mix if he were to become available. They are monitoring that situation. Just what is your read on that situation, and what have you heard? Because you've obviously put out numerous things about the Nets being linked there.
My read is that he has been in the past their priority number one. He is still their priority number one should he become available. My read is also that he personally enjoys New York, and that he owns multiple businesses in New York and comes here frequently. Now, that being said, Kevin Durant, his business is still located here, and that he left. So you can own a business here. You can come here and vacation and not have to play here. So none of those things are guarantees. He is not demanded out. But the read is that these assets were not all gathered with the idea of making these picks. These assets and the cap space were gathered so that you would have, and I know this word triggers some, optionality, flexibility, to be able to pounce should he become available. And I'm sure that there are other players that have given no signs of being available that would also fit that description. But that is my read on the situation, that's still the guy that they would be eyeing, and one of the only, if not the only guy that would be able to pry them from the path that they're on. And it's a path that they paid heavily, dearly to be able to be on. They didn't just get these picks back for nothing. They got them back with the intent of building through the draft if and unless Giannis became available.
Okay. Yeah. And I think, I wrote my article when I wrote about the questions that I asked Sean. As I said, I was viewing what he was saying as that 1A superstar type of guy. And if we're looking at, there's plenty of stars in the league, but if we're talking about those guys, the guys who can be, the number one player on a championship team, we're saying 8, 9 of those guys probably in the league. And that's being generous. It's really usually like you need a top 5 or a top 6 guy. And Giannis is unquestionably one of those guys. Obviously it's Jokic, SGA, Giannis, probably put Luka in that conversation. And beyond that, it gets a little bit murkier. And there's obviously a lot of stars and guys that I think the Nets would still be interested in. But he's one of those guys. And I think obviously Nets fans have some PTSD from their past going down the star path. And although this is a very different situation, I think the fact that Giannis is 30, going on 31 years old makes some Nets fans uneasy. But I think the fact that he is, the opportunity to acquire a player who is a top 3, 4 player in the NBA and is still, in his prime, even if getting towards the latter stage, those are very rare opportunities. We're looking at the guys that the Nets have had on their team in their history. I think KD, obviously got to that level. You had Jason Kidd, who was playing at an MVP level. Then beyond that, you're going back to Dr. J, and they weren't even in the NBA back then. So it's like, I understand the unrest from some Nets fans, and I did a whole podcast about it after you put that story out last week or the week before. And I said that I'm not sure. I would lean towards not doing it. But obviously there's so many questions that, have yet to be answered that would impact that decision. But my point being, when you have a guy of that caliber who's available, you definitely have to investigate that and pursue that to some extent. Whether you end up doing it or not, obviously, is a different conversation. But, obviously there's a lot more things that are going to impact that have yet to come out. But when you think about whether or not they should do that and whether or not that's your opinion on whether or not that's the path they should pursue or going through the build through the draft, just which way do you lean right now?
Well, I try not to look at things too black and white. To me, it's always gray. Um, so I wouldn't just look at Giannis and look at a 30 next to his name and rule him out. So he's 30. That's geriatric. Forget it. I don't want any 30-year-olds. No, I wouldn't look at it that way. I think he is. Listen, all right. I understand that I'm probably a little jaded, right? I've been covering the NBA for a while and covering sports for far longer. Um, Giannis is one of the few guys, and I've said this for years. He's one of the few guys that I would, if I were doing something else, if I were an accountant, if I were an architect, an engineer, whatever, that I would pay my hard-earned money to watch, even if he wasn't on my team, right? If I had no season tickets, that I would pay my money to buy my way into Barclays Center or the Garden or TD, wherever I would pay to watch that guy because I love watching the impossible, right? Some things are skill, right? And Steph is wondrously skilled. Trey is wondrously skilled. Ball is wondrously skilled. Giannis does the impossible. And that's what I want to see. I want to see things that make me wonder, is this the Matrix? Is this CGI? Am I really seeing this? Now, that's just for the entertainment factor.
Which is a big factor,
Which is a
obviously,
big factor.
for
Right.
ownership.
It's
I mean,
relevant.
people like to obviously think like when ownership and people are looking at this, they look at the same way that some fans do, which is what is the optimal route to get us to a championship? And I think that that's obviously a huge and main priority. But to act like entertainment, putting butts in seats, marketability of things isn't, it's also a huge factor. And sometimes it takes a front seat to, the championship route. So, as you were saying, I'm just pointing out that that's in the mind
it
of
is
ownership.
relevant. Now, as far as Giannis and would I make a move? I would say I would absolutely investigate that and follow that, right? When a player of that caliber becomes available, and again, as I said, to my knowledge, he has not asked out or demanded out, but it is something I would 100% investigate, and it was something I would 100% pursue. What the price is the only question to me. It's not whether I would be interested. That's not a question. It's can I afford to pay the price that would be demanded? And I don't know what that price would be. And of course, there is a point where you'd have to walk away and say no. I am not saying damn the torpedoes and give him, a share of the team and his own plane. I'm not saying any of that, but I am saying within reason, the price would have to be exorbitant for me to turn away from that because I think he is one of the few guys that does make you a contender. You can build a contending team around him in one offseason. And I don't know that you can do that with any of those other players that we've discussed, whether that's Trey or whether that's LaMelo or, as good as Sabonis is, and I think Sabonis is very good. I don't know that I can say that about any of those other players.
It's fair. And I said there's going to be a lot of other factors that influence this conversation. And one of those will be how, what that's going to impact the price is how much does Giannis, try to influence his leverage and, kind of direct his way to a one team, or however many teams are on his list. He has 2 years left on his contract. So that limits, the amount of leverage that he has. But how many other teams are in the mix? How much does the price go up? I tried to do my best on my last podcast to kind of game this out. And I said, looking at the core guys that the Nets have, I'd say Cam Thomas, Nick Claxton, Cam Johnson are the three main guys. And I think at a minimum, you're giving up, two of those guys at least, and then probably 4 or 5 first-round picks at least. So to me, the question became, obviously, does it go beyond that price? And if you give that up, do you have the assets? Do you have the flexibility in this new CBA to put a contending roster around Giannis for, 2, 3, 4 years? Like, would they have enough left over to do that? And I think it's also fair to note, if you're weighing the upside of that path versus the build through the draft path, this new CBA impacts, that equation, and acquiring veteran superstar players and trying to build it on the fly is more difficult in this new CBA because there's the second apron, which is effectively a hard cap. And you know it better than anyone. When the Nets had, Kyrie, KD, Harden, and Joe Tsai was just blowing through the luxury tax and spending and spending and spending to try to give that team the best chance to win, as Steve Ballmer was doing with the Clippers, as some other owners do now. This new CBA really was put in place, a lot of other reasons, but one of them was to limit that and to kind of level the playing field and to put that second apron into place to restrict these owners from just spending and spending and spending into the luxury tax and to have that competitive advantage. And it's a reason why I asked Sean, how do you think this new CBA impacts how you build? Because I wanted to see, if the Nets were thinking about going to that star equation, is how much of it is that in his mind? And his quote, what he says, I do think it is important to have guys under contract that you control the contract, so to speak. You drafted them, you developed them, and they got to their second contract under your watch. It's difficult when you're trying to acquire max level talent on max contract. Those days are probably gone of going and getting 2 to 3 max free agents and so forth. Those are going to be more difficult to do, but I do think it is important to have some value contracts on your roster. And how we do that, we've got to draft right. So I think it brings into an interesting conversation of, what's the higher upside? You get the Giannis move, or what's more feasible? You have the Giannis path, you have the building through the draft. There's obviously, upsides and downsides of both sides of it. But I do think the CBA impacts it. And I think another big, something that popped into my mind when I'm thinking about this conversation is Sean Marks' job and just self-preservation. Because I think to GMs, it's always, that's always a part of the thought process, whether or not it should be. It's just human nature. And when you're going after a guy like Giannis, Sean Marks would be expediting that timeline where it's 2, 3, 4 at the high end year window. Whereas if you go through the draft route and you're drafting these guys, I feel like you kind of buy yourself more time saying, hey, look, we got these guys who are 18, 19 years old, who are next year. If you take next year, you're getting guys who are 18 years old at this time next year. You're going to say, we need a very extended runway to develop those guys. So what's your opinion on that? Because I just think that's an interesting conversation of, if you're looking at it from the front office perspective, I think the draft route gives you a much longer runway to kind of go to ownership and say, look, we need to build this out over an extended amount of time, as opposed to expediting that timeline and going kind of for the quick fix and what would be a shorter window.
I would agree with that. I would agree that obviously the rebuild does give you a certain amount of job security. Right? Now, I'm going to be the first one to tell you, I do not know exactly what his contract status is. I don't know. I wish I did, but I don't. But yeah, just common sense would say that if you were to acquire Giannis and you're now building a contender, your mandate is to win now or come as close as you can to it. If you are rebuilding, especially if you're going in for another year like this, going after, Boozer or, what have you. And now you have a bunch of 18 and 19 and 20-year-olds on your roster. That is extending your time frame. And by default, buying yourself some long-term job security. Yes, that's 100% true.
Yeah, so just looking at it from that perspective, I think I do think, obviously, like you said, the Nets would be interested in Giannis. But from the front office's perspective, a lot of fans are saying, they won't tank, they won't do this, they won't go in the rebuild. That might be, maybe fans are skeptical of whether ownership would do that. But from Sean Marks' end, it's not a bad deal, going into the rebuild. And obviously, tanking is difficult, but from his perspective of job security, it's not a bad path for him. You would argue, you'd be surprised if a lot of GMs got to go into what is the third or fourth iteration of their, phase of their team being with the team. And this is now another rebuild. You might not think it, but if he has that luxury and that runway, it's not a bad deal for him. That's just kind of what I was trying to outline there. And obviously a lot of these things are going to, reveal themselves and unfold as we get closer to the draft and beyond that. Another thing I wanted to touch on was Cam Johnson, because I think that it's pretty clear that Cam Johnson was the top player on this Nets team this past season. And, Cam Thomas obviously is in that conversation, but he only played 25 games. Cam was their most consistent, their most dependable player, and also emerged as, I think, the most respected voice and the veteran leader of the group. And obviously, a lot of fans thought that he should have been traded during the season to cash in on his value. He had a career best season to help the tank. The Nets didn't do it. They held on to him through the trade deadline. And I asked Sean about it, how do you balance Cam's leadership with teams potentially calling on him and having trade interest in him this summer? And he said pretty much there was no shortage of teams calling on Cam at the deadline, but that he thinks that Cam's a very high character guy. They're not in a hurry to move on from those guys, and that he wants him to take on more of a leadership role. So I think it's kind of clear in my eyes, if you're talking about, are they going to trade Cam Johnson? I think that answer was very telling. What did you take from that? What was your read on that?
I mean, I took it at face value. There are teams that were interested. There may be different teams or perhaps the same teams that are still interested. He clearly has not only been put into a leadership role, but relished it. And he's right in that sweet spot where he could be part of a rebuild. He also certainly, as you point out, when you look at the salary and you look at his ability, could be packaged in a trade, if need be, for a star. He also is good enough and probably valuable enough that he could be between those two things. In other words, let's say for the sake of argument, the price for Giannis is too high, or say Giannis never asks out or goes elsewhere, whatever the case may be, and you decide you are going to go next year and try to get in the lottery again. You could trade Cam, and matter of fact, I would say really it might be incumbent upon you to trade Cam for let's call it a lesser player that comes with draft picks attached. Wherever that is, wherever that's sending him, doesn't matter. It could be sending him to Cleveland or to Indiana or wherever. That is certainly also possible. And I would think he would fetch you a decent amount of draft equity. It wouldn't be an insignificant amount.
Yeah. And, I'm just, based on what Sean said, though, with him basically him and management saying, we talked to Cam and we want him to take on more of a leadership role, I think he'll be on the team going into next season. How that impacts the tank. The Nets weren't worried about it this past year. We'll see if they're worried about that at any point next year, but
I would disagree that they weren't worried about. I mean, Dennis was a clear leader.
Well, they weren't worried about Cam, I'm saying. I mean, they held Cam through the trade deadline, I'm saying. And he did impact, I think, them winning games, and they seemed, okay with holding on to him. And obviously, I think, like you said, his age and him being able to fit into multiple timelines plays into that conversation. I mean, that Sean literally said that when I asked him the question about Cam. I didn't read the full quote, but part of it was, I can't think of a pathway that Cam doesn't fit in. There's so many ways you could build this with Cam Johnson. So I think that is, that's pretty black and white in terms of he thinks that he can fit multiple pathways, and maybe he didn't feel the same about Dennis and Dorian, or those guys were just on expiring contracts, and Cam's a little bit younger, obviously. So he can fit both of the pathways. I think based on them having, I'd say they're going to have at least 2 or 3 high-end first-round picks, 18-year-old guys coming in next year. I think the importance of having veteran guys who they trust to be voices in that locker room isn't, obviously the importance of that isn't lost upon them. And I think that's why you're seeing them go to Cam and saying, we want you to be more of a leader. Now, I think if they're trying to tank next year, I think it's pretty clear that Cam will hurt the tank. To how much, it's up for debate, but you do need to have some leaders. I think fans sometimes overlook the importance of that. Like fans were like, there's a lot of fans out there, Nets fans, who this past season were like, we'd put 15, 19-year-olds on that roster and, let them go 0-82. And like, it's just about that. And I understand the urgency there, but you do need to have some of the right vets in place, to kind of show those guys the ropes and, show them how stuff is getting done. So if I'm thinking about Cam's situation, I think he's going to be on the team next year. I think that they really like him based on these comments. I think that they think that he fits both bills, and they think that he's going to be really important to showing some of these young guys the day-to-day and how to be a pro and having the right guy in their ears. Do you disagree with that?
I don't disagree with your premise. I just think it's too limiting. When you say, because example, you said both paths. There's not just two. I pointed out a third.
Oh, you're saying if he's included in the star package.
And when you say, included in a star package or moved, as an example, December 15th.
Okay, yeah, that's
and traded for a
the
player
season
that will not hurt your tank. And believe me, there's a lot of them out there that will not hurt your tank, that come with, I don't know, you ask for 2 firsts. The guy on the other end laughs at you and says, I'll give you a first. And I say, I'll give me a first and a swap. And he says, I'll give you a first and a second, and X player. Whatever the case may be, the player is moved somewhere between December and January. And I would contend that is still tanking. I understand that there are some that would disagree with that assessment and say, no, he has to be gone 6 months ago. Anything less than that, and it's a failure and it's malpractice. I get that. I understand. But when you say, will he be on the team next year? Yeah, well, if he's here on opening day, you might say, well, that means he's here next year. Other people might say, well, by next year, do you mean the entire season?
Mm-hmm.
Is he there playing in the finale or sitting in the finale in street clothes, whatever?
Yeah.
So I guess it's semantics.
No, I understand what you're saying. I guess to clarify, I could totally see him being included in a star package. I said, they have only a few core guys that I think a team like the Bucks would want. He would probably be one of those guys. So I can definitely see that. I'm saying short of that, and I meant entering next season, I think he's going to be on the team. Could they win more games than they did? Could they win more games than they're expecting, as they did earlier this year, and pivot, and he would be, the next vet to be traded in that situation? I could definitely see that. I think entering the year, though, I would be surprised if he's traded this summer in anything outside of a star trade. I think that was my read on the situation. And I do think that they really like him. I think obviously in a star scenario where they're getting a Giannis, they would want to keep him to put him alongside that guy. Is that feasible? I think not, but we'll see. But basically my read on it, they like Cam a lot. They want him to be a leader for these draft picks that they're going to bring in, and also the young guys they already have on the roster. And I think that is going to keep him on the roster, at least for, a certain amount of time. We'll see how that impacts a potential tank. We'll see if a star team comes calling, and we'll see everything. But I think that it's looking strongly likely that he's entering the year on the roster. Closing this out, all the players talked, obviously. Not all of them, but most of the significant players spoke to us. Anything from any of the players' comments that jumped out to you that you thought was very noteworthy?
It was noteworthy to me that Nick acknowledged that his back is still an issue. He did say he has a plan, but does not expect to need surgery. As I said, major or minor. Now, I don't know what exactly that means. I don't know what the plan is. I don't know, and I'm not going to play doctor. I don't know whether he would consider an epidural as surgery. I don't know. But I thought that was noteworthy. And I certainly agree with you. Cam Johnson was the most reliable player. And I agree, Cam Thomas was their leading scorer. I think if you have a healthy Nick and both his mind and his body are right, I would certainly put him in that category. I think that highly of him in terms of his talent. So I think it's incumbent upon the Nets to get him right, uh, unless he's traded. But I think which again is also possible.
Yep.
He's another guy who when you talk about ruining the tank, I mean, he's a guy that has that capacity. And he's also a guy that you could get something for.
Yeah.
Whichever direction, whether you're packaging him with CJ or packaging him with CT, or whether you're trading him for picks. He is another guy that has some value. So that was noteworthy.
And just before you go on to the next thing, just so fans have an idea, it's been a while since kind of we went through the timeline of that. He told us that he had a different injury, a hamstring injury, right at the beginning of the season. But
yes.
then he later revealed to us he had a back strain also and got an epidural for it at the beginning of the season. And then he revealed to us that he hurt his back during the off season and it was limiting the things that he was able to do. And then he went into the season with the hamstring and the back. Who knows if those are related? He got an epidural. He played through the rest of the season, missed a few, stretches there, but from what he's saying, obviously he didn't produce well this season. He was the worst on the team in terms of net rating. I think his defensive impact was down. I think obviously the Nets rebuilding situation had something to do with that, but he's pretty much saying I wasn't right the whole season. My back is still bothering me. And I think that's obviously, as you said, noteworthy and concerning, the fact that this started last offseason. We're going into this offseason and it has not been resolved yet. He's saying it's still bothering him. So we'll see, but how much you believe it, I never want to call injuries into question. He's just saying, I think I didn't produce well this season. I was hurt the whole year and I didn't feel like myself. And I now have a full off season to get right. And, we'll see what that bears out. So I think that's the Knicks situation. Go on to what you were saying about your next point.
Yeah, I would say that was noteworthy. Cam Johnson saying that he would go to Sean and ask him where he stands in this, their long-term plans. I thought that was noteworthy. I thought it was noteworthy that Cam Thomas, despite his 4 hamstring injuries, does not seem overly concerned that anything needs to change in his training regimen or his preparation.
That's something that I wanted to talk to you about because you asked him both times we've spoken to him. You asked him that last time when we spoke to him right after he got ruled out for the season and this time. And both times he said, he called them fluke injuries. And I'm not a doctor. You're not a doctor. I don't think either of us are going to cosplay as doctors, but I think we'd say when you have 3 hamstring strains to the same hamstring in one season, can you call those fluke injuries? I think you might need to reevaluate something that's going on, in a process. Not saying that it's his fault. I'm just saying, I think it's tough to call it fluky when you have 3 of them in one season. Would you agree?
I would agree. Hamstrings are an injury that have a ridiculously high percentage of reoccurrences.
Yes. Yeah.
Now listen, he's a great scorer. He's a wonderful athlete, and he's 10 times the athlete I'll ever be. I will just say that hammies are tricky. And many, many years and many, many pounds ago, when I was running track in college, I ripped my hamstring and it essentially ended my track career. They're really, really tricky. And they're sneaky because you think you're better and you're not. Again, I'm not a doctor. I'm not a physiotherapist, not a kinesiologist. If he's convinced that he doesn't need to change anything, so be it. It would just be a concern to me.
No, yeah.
It would be a concern to me if I were him, and it would be a concern to me if I were the team. How do I keep my best scorer on the floor? What is necessary physically or training-wise to keep him healthy?
And
that's all I'm saying.
Again, acknowledging that neither of us are doctors. Something that I've noticed about Cam, because his second year was my first year on the beat, I obviously watched him when he got drafted and stuff. He looks substantially bigger in terms of bulk and muscle now than he did which is to be expected to a certain extent. But like when I'm next to Cam in the locker room and I'm up close to him and I'm like this, he looks like a bowling ball, like not like he looks like he's in great shape and he's not like, he's not fat obviously or anything like that, but he got significantly bulkier throughout his time with the Nets. And I wonder, like carrying that around and doing the things that he kinds of do, is it better for him to try to slim down a little bit and not be carrying that type of weight? Because he's a guy who's very jittery. I think 2 of the 3 times he hurt his hamstring, he might have been stepping back. That might have been part of it. I don't know. I just like, what's your opinion on that? Obviously, we don't have medical degrees, but he does look substantially bulkier and bigger than he did early on when he came into the Nets, right?
Well, it's by design. I mean, it wasn't an accident.
Yeah.
He purposely said, I'm going to. I mean, he always had scoring talent, right? And that was part of the frustration, I know, of a lot of the fans, that JV didn't seem to trust him. And every time he was out there, he scored. And then he would find himself back on the bench sitting next to JV. But when it became obvious that he was actually going to get an opportunity to play more, he said, I'm going to go out and I'm going to bulk up and I'm going to add some weight because I'm a young guy, I'm 21, and I'm going to be hurling myself through the lane against big grown men. So he purposely added weight. I don't want to imply that it was like an accident or it was irresponsible or he's just eating cheeseburgers or what have you. He decided, I'm going to add weight because it will help me, right? It will help me get through the rigors of this season healthy. And unfortunately, this year he played 25 games.
25, yep.
So he is much bigger. He's thicker. He's stronger. And he accomplished that of adding, good weight and some muscle, but he does not seem quite as explosive. And that's one of the things, I guess, that, was given up in that quest to get bigger. As far as him staying healthy and as far as him keeping that hamstring right, I don't know. I don't know what's needed for that. I wish I did.
Yeah.
You can just hope for the best and hope that they find a happy medium there to keep him on the floor.
I just think, I'm just pointing it out. Just think it's noteworthy that he had these hamstring injuries. I do think that he looks significantly bulkier and bigger. And I do think outside of just the hamstring injuries that has impacted somewhat the way that he's played. I mean, he's still an unbelievable scorer. He can still do a lot of things. I think this year I forgot the number. I read it recently, but he had way less dunks this year in terms of just like per game basis. Like he was dunking. He's still getting to the rim, but I think he was more, he took a lot more threes, so that's a reason, but he was taking more jump shots. I do think, as you said, he looks a little bit less explosive. I think he's stronger, and that helps him in creating separation and doing different things. I just think it's noteworthy. He's a lot bigger, and he had 3 hamstring injuries this season. He doesn't seem concerned about it. He doesn't seem like he's going to change anything really in his process of training or, his body. I think he feels good about that. So we'll see. We'll see if he's able to stay healthy next season. And closing it out, Cam's involved in this conversation. There's a bunch of free agents. There's 3 restricted free agents. Cam, obviously, Day'Ron Sharpe, Zaire Williams. We already spoke with Cam, and we've both written pieces about it because he spoke about it right after he got ruled out for the season. Basically, Cam has said that he wants to be back. We'll see, what ownership. We'll see if we can get a deal done. Day'Ron and Zaire talked about it for the first time. And both of them, I think, pretty black and white said, I want to be back with the Nets. And that is, that would be their first choice. I think Day'Ron was a little bit more short-winded in his answer. Zaire pretty much said, I think Brooklyn's the best place for me, and I want to be here. And the Nets are obviously in great position to retain those guys if they want to. So, what do you see with that? Your opinion on those guys. I think that my read on it is I think that all 3 of them are going to be back. I think Cam obviously is the most interesting in terms of what his contract is going to be, but in terms of the Nets free agent conversation and their prospects of retaining those guys.
I certainly expect Day'Ron to be back. Whatever. What I don't know what he gets. Spotrac was suggesting 10 million. That probably seems fair.
Yeah.
And yes, I had talked with him, I don't know, maybe a month ago, and he had expressed a desire to be back, and he certainly reiterated that the other day. I would expect him to be here. Cam, I would also expect probably to be here. I don't know how much he gets. And I think we've discussed this before.
We have.
He has been impossible for me to get a grip on because every time I ask somebody, I get a different number.
I've had similar, although I would say I've spoken to a few people throughout the league and I've gotten a little bit more consensus now. And I think that might be just because he's getting close to free agency. So they're feeling the need to actually give a guess. I wrote this in one of my recent articles, like 18 to 24 million. That's somewhat of a large range.
Yes.
I've heard, based on what I've heard from several people, not with the Nets, but in the league, their opinions, front office people have said, they think it would fall within that range of 18 to 24 annually. That's kind of the read I'm getting on it. Now, how many years is up for debate?
That's fair. I spoke with Yossi Goslin and he suggested, Colin Sexton's contract, but just inflation adjusted. Somebody else told me 20. Somebody else told me 20 to 22. Spotrac, I believe, came in at
they were low,
15 or something.
It was like 3 for 45, I think.
Yeah.
Keith
so
said that.
Again, I guess you would say 15 to 22 is not a ridiculously huge range, but to me, that's a sizable range because I think if you asked anybody else the year Cam Johnson was coming up for free agency, they could pin what Cam Johnson was going to get.
Yeah.
If you would ask when Nick was a free agent, you could pin what Nick was going to get. Now here we are, getting up to, free agency, and we're still getting, 15 to 25 on Cam Thomas.
Yeah.
But whatever. I do expect him to be back. I don't know how much it's for. My only concern is that, I don't know if concern is the right word, but I know he would have liked to have gotten his extension before.
Yeah.
And when he didn't get an extension, you see he switched agents. Even though everybody and their mother and their dog wrote that he wasn't getting an extension. And he still switched agents. So I don't know what his opinion is. And he clearly said the other day, I know my worth. Or I know my value.
Yeah.
I don't know whether his value agrees with their value.
Well, I asked him.
I don't know. I'm not saying it doesn't. I know.
I
know that there's this.
I just want to interject quickly that I asked him the first time we spoke to him, right after he got ruled out for the season, do you feel you've done enough in these 2 seasons since entering the rotation to kind of solidify yourself as a core piece or prove that you should be a core piece? And he said, when I've played, I feel like I've been one of the best shooting guards in the league. And he obviously believes that. And I pointed that out after he said that there's going to be a discrepancy in a gap in terms of how Cam thinks he's valued and how the NBA and other front offices think he's valued. Because in Cam's eyes, as he said, he's one of the best guards in the league. And I think anybody who feels that way about themselves feels that they should be compensated accordingly. And he's not going to get best guard in the league type money. So where does that leave him? Where does that leave him with his agent, with, the front office, with the Nets, wherever? It's to be determined. I think it could impact potentially the length of the deal, because if he's not getting that type of annual money, my read on it, I've thought that it's going to be a short-term deal, because if he's not getting that type of money that he thinks he's worth, he's not going to lock himself into 4 years or whatever. And a lot of people might say, hey, like, you can't gamble on that. You need the security or whatever. The thing that I've gone back to people who've said that to me is, I don't know if I've met many players who are more confident in their abilities than Cam Thomas. So if you're talking about players who are willing to bet on themselves on a short-term deal, Cam is not lacking any confidence to go and bet on himself on a short-term deal. So yeah, so I think both of us agree. Like, it is interesting though. You said, like, I spoke to you. I had Yossi on this podcast to talk about it, and he gave a figure that I think was like $25 million annually, and he thought that it was going to be longer term. I didn't think so, but he said $25 million annually. He is obviously a salary cap person. Like, this is what he does.
Absolutely.
Keith Smith at Spotrac said 3 years, $45 million. So that's a $15 million. That's a $10 million gap, as you're
That's what I'm
pointing
saying.
So
that's what I'm saying. I cannot get a gauge on it, and I rely on them because that's what they do.
Yeah.
So when I ask people who know more about it than I do, they're all over the map with it. With him in particular, not with anybody else.
Yeah.
Just with Cam. So I don't know. I don't know whether his view of his value matches their view of his value. It might, and then maybe you get something done early. They have the early window to talk to him as soon as the finals are over, and that's why I asked him. I said, "Do you expect to get something done in that early window, or do you think you're going to have to go out and let the market decide?" But if he doesn't get what he thinks he's worth, he does seem the sort that is more than willing to bet on himself on a shorter deal. And then, of course, there's also the possibility that for him to really get paid, it might have to be in a sign and trade.
Yeah. And I think I've pointed this out ad nauseum, since Cam got ruled out for the season and this conversation shifted towards his free agency. But the Nets are the only team with cap space. Somebody else could open cap space. They could try to. It'd be difficult. You'd have to maneuver. I don't think teams are doing that to sign Cam Thomas to an exorbitant deal. So even if he does hit the market and the Nets don't get that deal done and they say, go see what you can get in an offer sheet, there's nobody with cap space. So a lot of the teams in the league, the most they're going to be able to offer him is the $14 million non-taxpayer mid-level exception.
And he's not.
So the net, and he's not, going to want to take that. So even if the Nets, and I don't think the Nets are going to squeeze him. Like, I think they'll pay him above that, what he's worth. But that 15 to 25 million between, Keith at Spotrac and Yossi, I'd say it falls somewhere in the middle of that. I think it would be a shorter term deal, and I think he'll be back with the Nets. And we'll see, we'll see how it plays out. But
Zaire is the other one, and Zaire's draft positioning. And the fact that his draft positioning is going to make his qualifying offer pretty high. I think he clearly wants to be back. I'm not sure exactly how much it'll be on, but I do see certainly a desire to come back from Zaire's point of view.
Definitely. And his qualifying offer, I think, is like a little bit above $8 million. And people I've spoken to say that the Nets are gonna decline that qualifying offer, which would make him, because if not, that $8 million stays on it eats into their cap space as a cap hold. And if they decline it, he goes into unrestricted free agency. And I'd be surprised if Zaire gets more than $8 million a year. So financially, it makes the most sense for the Nets to decline it. Let Zaire hit unrestricted free agency. I still would have confidence that once they do that, he's back. We'll see on how much, but I would think it's another kind of prove it deal. But we'll see. That's all I have. Brian, anything else you want to add about the baggy day? That's it.
No, I think we hit it all.
Okay. Well, I appreciate you for coming on, Brian. Everybody, most of the people who are on this, I would think, follow your work because you've been doing it for such a long time. But you guys can find all Brian's stuff at the New York Post. We're entering the off season. We're going to have some draft. We'll have the lottery. We'll have draft conversation. We'll circle back. I'm sure you'll be on again at some point.
We'll have tiebreakers in about a week, probably.
Tiebreakers. There we go. We got pick 18 to 20. And we didn't even get into the draft position, but you guys can all look at that. But yeah, the Bucks pick can fall anywhere from 18 to 20. We got tiebreakers that should be coming out in the next week or 10 days. But Brian, you'll be back on to discuss all that. And I appreciate you taking the time as always, man.
Oh, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
That does it for this episode of Believe in Nets on the Believe Podcast Network, your one-stop shop for everything happening across the sports and entertainment world. Hope you guys enjoyed the talk with Brian. As I said at the top of the show, if you do not already, go to my YouTube channel at Erik Slater NBA. Subscribe. If you enjoyed this, like it. Leave a comment what you think the Nets should do this offseason, how you feel about the potential past that that Brian and I laid out, the potential Cam Johnson free agent market, or excuse me, Cam Thomas free agent market, any of that. Leave a comment. Let me know what you think. Hit that like button and subscribe. But you guys can find all my work on clutchpoints.com. Articles every day. I'm going to be doing some more draft stuff and covering all of that as we get closer to the lottery and deeper into the offseason. You can also follow me on Twitter at Erik Slater _ where I'm posting all my work and a lot of different stuff, including podcasts, clips, articles, all that good stuff. But we're trending towards the lottery. NBA playoffs are getting underway. There's a lot of exciting offseason stuff to come for the Nets, and I'll have coverage of all of that here on Believe in Nets. Talk to you guys soon.